I'm going to try to record a video of making a window mount. There are a couple of different ways to do window mounting, and the first one is like the one on the board here, where I've cut the window just a little bit bigger than the actual size of the print. So I've got a margin of white all the way around the edge of the print. The advantage of that is that the whole of the print that you've created is going to show. The other way to do it is like this one, where I haven't got any white space, and actually the window is cut tight to the edge of the picture, so you're actually going to make it a millimetre or two smaller than the picture size and overlap to make sure you've got no white showing. In this case, if there is anything that's really critical to be seen at the edge, you might end up just covering it up a little bit, but it is down to taste which way you do it. The boards can be mounted, and for competitions where you send pictures away, they're usually mounted, and one way to do it is with a grey board. The grey board, however, I find it's quite expensive to buy now, and it's not so much less expensive than the mount itself. So you could use another piece of mount board, or you could do what I do, which is where I've mounted the picture and then backed it, I use a thin piece of card. It will protect the image sufficiently, and it will comply with the rules where pictures have to be backed. And the kind of board that I use is a very thin board. This is A2 card, and it's a 300 gram card, so it's fairly thick, it's thick enough, but it doesn't come in the size of the boards. The boards are 50 by 40 centimetres, 500 by 400 millimetres, and the card doesn't come in that size, so you have to buy it bigger and then you have to trim it down. But that's not a problem because it's very cheap. This costs £17 for 50 sheets. So it's a very practical way to back the pictures. And so today we're going to have a look at mounting a picture like this one, which has a border all around it. And the photograph that I'm going to use is this one. So we need to measure the size of the print itself. It's on A3 paper. I would suggest when you're printing it not to print right to the very edge of the paper, because if you do, you're not going to have any space at all when you mount it. You want the picture to have enough space to adhere to the back of the mount and have a little bit of extra border beyond the size of the window. So the first thing that we have to do is measure the size of the print. I'm measuring this in millimetres. And this is 369 millimetres wide. So I'm writing that down. Measure the short edge, which is 280 millimetres. So if you were going to cut the aperture to that size, it would be very tight to the image, and you would really struggle to make sure you don't have a little bit of white showing that you don't want. So what I'm going to do is actually leave a few millimetres either side all the way around, and I'm going to choose 4 millimetres to each side. So on the width of 369 millimetres I have to add 8 millimetres, and on the width of 280 I also have to enter 8 millimetres. We'll just check those sizes because it's always good to measure twice. So that's 280 and 369, and if I add the 8 millimetres for the border to those, these are the sizes that I want to cut the aperture, 377 by 288 millimetres. And I'm now going to go and have a look at my Excel spreadsheet, which will calculate the width of the margins that we need. This is my Mat Designer, which is a simple Excel spreadsheet. It will also work on the free software like OpenOffice. It's been designed to work out the margins for me, which is quite easy. If you have a look at the notes, first of all it just says enter dimensions in black. You don't want to enter anything where the figures are in red because those are calculated with formulas. You can put the units in either in inches or centimetres, but because our board size is in millimetres, it makes sense to me to work entirely in millimetres. So if you input millimetres, you get millimetres out. It's important first of all to measure your board. Now you might buy some ready cut boards that are 500 by 400 millimetres, 50 by 40 centimetres, but when you actually measure them they may not be, and a couple of millimetres out is going to make a difference to your margins. So for example, I've had boards that are 502 by 399, and you want to put those exact calculations, those exact measurements in, so you can just click on the number, and if it was 499, just enter that into the spreadsheet. So we're going to put 500 in there because it's a landscape board. If you have a portrait style board, you can put your 500 in here by your 400 there, and it will work it out for you as a portrait format. So 500 wide by 400 high is what we have. And we've already made our measurements of the actual print and added on the 4mm all the way around. So we have a width for the window of 377 and a height for the window of 288. So in the box, the yellow box on the side here, it gives the suggested values. The usual way with photographers is to give a little bit more space at the bottom of the mount than at the top, and this is worked out on that basis using a formula to calculate a small difference between the top and the bottom margins. But because we've got 59.92 as a suggested value, doesn't mean that we have to use that. We can actually change things, and as you see, if we put in 50.5 there, then it will give us 61.5 margin for the bottom, which is actually identical to the side margins that it's given. We could say if we wanted, we could put 45mm in there, or 46 I've put in, and it will output for a 66mm base. Now 20mm is quite a lot of difference for the margins at the bottom, so let's put 50.5 in there, and it works out 61.5. It's just really convenient for me when I'm cutting the board to have three measurements that's exactly the same, and I don't have to keep changing the dimensions on the mount cutter. So what I've got here is a bottom margin of 61.5. The left and the right margins are equal at 61.5, and the top margin is at 55.5. And then I write that down on my piece of paper and transfer those measurements when I'm actually cutting the board. Okay, so I've now consulted my spreadsheet and decided that the measurements I'm going to use will be a margin at the top of 50.5mm and then 61.5 on the other three edges. The way that artists make their measurements is that the top and bottom margins are usually the same. But with photographers, because we put the boards on a stand that often has a little stand up at the front of it, or a little depression to sit the mount in, you lose a little bit of the bottom of the mount, and so we usually have a slightly bigger margin on the bottom than on the top, and I've gone for about 11mm here. So it's important to mark the board before we cut it. The cutter itself will keep the margins the same as we cut, but we need to know where the corners are. So we're going to mark it on the back. This is a off-white board, but it does have a slight texture on the front. I'm just going to turn it over so that I can mark it up on the back. Because it's uneven margins all around, I usually mark the top with a T, and that helps me when I'm putting the measurements in and when I'm actually mounting it. So the first thing that we're going to do is measure on the scale here 50.5mm. That's 50.5, and tighten the scale up. And I'm going to slide the board in. Now you can make quite a long mark with the pencil. The pencil mark is only a guide to show us where the corners are going to be. So you can make quite a long mark because we need to cross the corners. And 61.5 for the other measurements. So 61.5, tighten it up. Now, the reason we've done that is so that when we are running the cutting blade along the edge of the cutter, we'll know where to begin and where to end our cut. Before we make a cut, we need to put an extra piece of board in. If you forget to put this in, then what happens is when you're making your cut, you get a raggy edge. The blade needs to go right through this mount board and then into the board behind it, and you'll get a nice clean edge. So we've got our 61 measured, we've got our top measured, so we know that's the smaller measurement. We can slide the board in hard up against the stopper. There's a little upstand here on my cutter, and there are two kinds of cutters supplied with this. The first cutter is just to slice the edge off, makes a straight cut all the way down, so for cutting the size of the board if you need to trim it. The second cutter has a 45-degree angle blade, and it runs along grooves in here on the cutter. So we just sit that into the groove. There's a little mark on the edge here where we can line the edge up with the pencil line that we've made. You do need to put a little bit of downward pressure on the whole thing to stop it moving, otherwise it slides about a little bit. But what we're going to try to do now is make a clean cut without moving the cutter, just to press the blade in with the thumb, right in, and then slide that along until we get to the other pencil line. Some of these cutters have a stopper, but mine is a less expensive one, and you have to stop when you get to the pencil line yourself. Retract the blade and lift it out. Next we're going to put one of the other edges which have the same width. Put the cutter in and line it up with the pencil mark, push the blade in, hold everything still and cut along until you get to the pencil line, retract the blade and lift it out. Going to make the third cut. In exactly the same way. And at this point we've got a bit of a flap where the three edges have been cut, but now we need to alter the measurement for the top border, and that's going to be 50.5. Put the board back in, make sure it's up against the stop. Again, lining up the pencil mark, pushing the blade in, and retracting. And hopefully you've got a mount. And hopefully you've cut it to the right size. So let's have a look. There we go. A nice, neat window mount with a 4mm border all the way around the print. Easy.